The stagecoach didn't stop. It slowed just long enough for the driver to shove a leather trunk off the back and holler something lost to the wind. Then the horses screamed forward, wheels cutting trenches through the mud, and the coach vanished into a wall of copper, dust like it had never existed at all. Clara Whitfield stood alone. She stood at the edge of a dirt road that stretched in both directions toward nothing. Behind her, a fence line sagged under the weight of dead tumbleweed. Ahead, maybe 200 yards up a rutted path, sat a ranch house, small, sun-bleached, leaning slightly to the east as if the years themselves had shoved it sideways. This wasn't right. The letter had described a prosperous cattle operation. 1,200 head. Foreman. A bunkhouse with 6 hands. A white house with a wraparound porch and glass windows shipped all the way from St. Louis. What she saw was a skeleton of a home surrounded by dust and silence. Her gloved fingers trembled around the crumpled letter in her pocket. She pulled it out and read the name again. Mr. V. Kane. Kane Ranch. Burial Flats, Wyoming Territory. She looked up at the wooden sign nailed crooked above the gate. It didn't say Kane Ranch. It said Hearthstone. Before she could turn around, before she could think, the front door of that crooked house creaked open, and the shadow of a man filled the frame. He had a rifle in his hands, and he was aiming it directly at her chest. The man didn't speak for a long time. He just stood there on the porch, the rifle leveled. His eyes narrowed against the late afternoon sun that burned like a furnace behind Clara's back. He was tall, taller than any man she'd known in Boston, with shoulders that looked carved from the same weathered wood as his house. His jaw was sharp beneath a week's worth of stubble, and a scar, pale and jagged, ran from his left temple down to the corner of his mouth. He looked like a man who had stopped expecting anything good to come up that road a long time ago. "You lost." His voice was low, not threatening exactly, but not welcoming either. Clara swallowed hard. Her mouth was full of dust. Her corset was soaked through with sweat beneath her traveling dress, and her legs ached from 14 hours on that miserable stagecoach from Cheyenne. She steadied herself. She was not a woman who stammered. Not anymore. "I'm looking for the Kane Ranch. Mr. Virgil Kane." Something changed in his face. It was subtle. A flicker behind the eyes, a tightening of the jaw, but Clara caught it. She'd spent years learning to read the smallest shifts in a man's expression. Her survival had depended on it. He lowered the rifle. Slowly. "Kane's place is 7 miles east," he said. "Other side of the creek bed. Past the bluffs. 7 miles. Clara looked back at the empty road. The stagecoach was long gone. The sun was dropping toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of blood and amber. She had no horse, no wagon, and the trunk at her feet weighed more than she did. "The driver said this was the stop," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "Driver's a drunk," the man replied. "Probably couldn't tell Hearthstone from a hole in the ground." He paused, studying her. His gaze moved from her dust-covered dress to the trunk to her face. "You one of those mail-order women?" The words hit her like a slap, though he hadn't meant them cruelly. There was no judgment in his tone, just recognition. Like he'd seen this before, women arriving in the territory with nothing but a letter and a prayer. "I'm Mr. Kane's betrothed," she said, lifting her chin. "We've been corresponding for 4 months." He stared at her for another long beat. Then he leaned the rifle against the porch railing and stepped down the stairs. Up close, he was even more imposing. His boots were cracked and caked with mud. His shirt was faded blue cotton, rolled to the elbows, revealing forearms roped with muscle and marked with old scars. He smelled like leather and wood smoke and something else. Something lonely. "Name's Silas Drummond," he said. He didn't offer his hand. "This is my land. What's left of it. Clara Whitfield." He nodded once, as if her name confirmed something he'd already decided. Then he looked west, toward the mountains, where clouds were stacking up in dark, angry towers. "Storm's coming," he said. "A bad one. You won't make it to Kane's tonight. Not on foot. Not in that." He gestured toward the sky. Clara opened her mouth to protest, but a gust of wind cut through the valley and nearly knocked her sideways. The temperature had already dropped 10 degrees in the last 5 minutes. She could feel it, the electricity in the air, the way the light turned sickly and green at the horizon. Wyoming storms were killers. Even she knew that. "I can't stay here," she said. "It wouldn't be proper." Silas almost smiled. Almost. The scar on his face tugged, and his lips twitched, but the expression didn't quite form, like he'd forgotten how. "Lady, there's nothing proper about anything west of the Missouri." He picked up her trunk with one arm, and carried it toward the porch. "You'll sleep inside. I'll take the barn. In the morning, I'll hitch the wagon and drive you to Kane's myself." He said it like it was settled. Clara watched him carry her entire life up those creaking steps and disappear into the dark house. She stood there for a moment, alone in the wind, the sky growling above her. She had the strangest feeling. A feeling she couldn't name and didn't trust. That she had just stepped off the edge of the life she'd planned and into something else entirely. Something she wasn't supposed to find. Then the first crack of lightning split the sky in half, and she ran for the door. The inside of the house was sparse but clean. That surprised her. She'd expected filth. Dishes piled in a basin, dust on every surface, the particular neglect that men living alone seemed to cultivate like a crop. But Silas Drummond's home, though humble, was kept with a quiet, almost painful care. The floors were swept. A cast-iron stove sat in the corner, a low fire already burning. There was a table with 2 chairs, only 2, and a shelf of books above the window. Real books. Dickens. Twain. A Bible with a cracked spine. On the mantel above the fireplace sat a single photograph in a tin frame. A woman. Young, dark-haired, with kind eyes and a shy smile. She wore a white dress, and wildflowers were tucked behind her ear. Clara looked at the photograph, then at Silas. He was standing by the stove, pouring coffee into a tin cup. He didn't look at the photograph. He didn't need to. It was clear he knew it was there, always knew it was there, the way a man knows where his wound is even without touching it. "Your wife?" Clara asked softly. "Was." He set the cup on the table in front of her. "Eliza." She passed. 3 years back. Fever took her in the winter. He said it plainly, the way men out here spoke of death, without drama, without self-pity, but with a weight that pressed the words flat. "I'm sorry. Don't be. You didn't know her." He sat in the other chair and wrapped his hands around his own cup. "Drink that. You look half dead." She drank. The coffee was strong and bitter and utterly perfect. Outside, the storm unleashed itself. Rain hammered the roof like fists. Thunder rolled across the valley in long, shuddering waves. Lightning turned the windows white, and in those flashes, Clara could see the land outside. Flat, vast, and violent with wind. They sat in silence for a while. It should have been uncomfortable, but it wasn't. Silas Drummond wasn't the kind of man who filled silence with noise. He seemed to live inside silence the way other men lived inside towns, naturally, without effort. After a time, he spoke again. "How much do you know about Virgil Kane?" The question caught her off guard. "Enough," she said carefully. "He wrote to me through an agency in Boston. He described his ranch, his situation. He said he wanted a wife, a companion. What else? He said he was a widower, a God-fearing man, that he needed someone to help build a home." Silas's jaw tightened. He stared into his coffee like he was reading something written at the bottom. "He tell you how his first wife died?" The room got colder. Clara felt it. Not from the storm, but from something in his voice. A warning. A door opening onto a dark room she hadn't known existed. "He said she took ill," Clara whispered. "That's one way to put it." Silas set his cup down. "Martha Kane didn't take ill, Miss Whitfield. She tried to leave him, packed a bag in the middle of the night and headed for the road. Virgil caught her before she reached the gate." He paused. "She was dead by morning. Doc Hadley said she fell down the stairs. But Martha Kane lived in a single-story house." Clara's hands went cold around the cup. That can't. I'm not telling you what to believe. I'm telling you what I know. What this whole valley knows. His eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw something besides weariness in them. She saw anger, controlled, buried deep, but burning. Virgil Kane is not the man he put in those letters. He's got money, sure. He's got cattle and land and a fine White House. But he's also got 2 ranch hands who do whatever he says, a sheriff in his back pocket, and a temper that's put 3 men in the ground that I know of. Clara set the cup down because her hands were shaking too badly to hold it. Why are you telling me this? Because you're sitting in my kitchen, and you deserve the truth before you walk into his. The storm screamed outside. A shutter banged against the wall like a gunshot, and Clara flinched. She thought about the letters. For months of careful, elegant words. Virgil Kane had written beautifully, poetically even. He'd described sunsets over the mountains and the sound of wind through the grass. He'd told her she was brave for answering his advertisement. He'd called her Dear Clara and signed every letter with yours faithfully. She had believed every word. Because she needed to. Because Boston had become a cage, and Virgil Kane's letters had been the key. Even if what you say is true, she said slowly, I have nowhere else to go. I spent every cent I had on the passage west. I have no family, no friends in this territory. That letter, that arrangement is all I have. Silas looked at her for a long time. The firelight moved across his scarred face, softening it, making him look younger and sadder than he probably was. Then stay here, he said. The words landed between them like a stone dropped into still water. Excuse me? I'm not proposing anything improper, he said quickly, and for the first time, color rose in his cheeks. I mean stay. Work the ranch. I need the help. God knows I need the help. Old Pete, my hand, he's 67 years old and half blind. The cattle are down to 40 head. The fences are falling. I can pay you room and board until you figure out your next step. Clara stared at him. You don't know me, she said. No, he agreed. But I know Virgil Kane. And I won't drive a woman to his door knowing what I know. He stood, took both cups to the basin, and washed them with the care of a man who had no one else to wash them for. The bedroom's through that door, he said, nodding toward the back of the house. Sheets are clean. Lock it if you want. I'll be in the barn. He pulled on a duster coat, grabbed the rifle, and walked out into the storm without looking back. Clara sat alone in the quiet kitchen, the fire crackling, the rain roaring, and the photograph of the dead woman watching her from the mantel. She realized, with a strange and terrifying certainty, that she didn't want to go to Virgil Kane's ranch. She didn't want to go at all. Morning came with a sky washed clean and pale, the kind of blue that only existed after violence, after the storm had spent itself and drifted east, leaving behind a world that looked new-made and trembling. Clara stepped onto the porch and breathed. The land around Hearthstone was not beautiful in the way Boston was beautiful. Not manicured, not ordered, not tamed. It was beautiful the way a scar is beautiful. It was honest. Red rock bluffs rose to the north, striated with layers of ancient stone. To the south, the valley opened into rolling grassland where a thin herd of cattle grazed near a creek that was swollen and muddy from the rain. The mountains to the west were capped with snow, even now in late spring, and they stood against the sky like sentinels watching over something sacred and forgotten. Silas was already working. She saw him near the barn, shirtless, swinging a hammer against a fence post. His back was a map of labor, muscle and bone moving under sun-browned skin, more scars visible now, some long and deliberate, others ragged. He worked with the grim focus of a man trying to outpace something he couldn't outrun. An old man sat nearby on an overturned bucket, whittling a piece of cedar and watching Silas with the fond, weary expression of a father watching a stubborn son. This, Clara would learn, was old Pete. You must be the bride, Pete said when she approached, his voice like gravel in a tin can. He grinned, and she saw he was missing several teeth. Heard about you from Silas this morning. Said the stagecoach dropped you at the wrong ranch. It did. Or the right one. Pete winked and went back to his whittling. Silas drove the post into the ground with one final blow and straightened. He wiped his forehead with the back of his arm and looked at her. In daylight, his eyes were gray, pale and clear, like creek water over stone. "Sleep all right?" he asked. "Better than I have in months," she admitted. He nodded. Something softened in his expression, just for a moment, before he caught it and put it away. "Offer still stands," he said. "You're welcome to stay until you sort things out. But I understand if you want to go to Kane's. I won't stop you. I'll hitch the wagon either way." Clara looked at the ranch. The leaning house, the patchy fences, the thin cattle, the old man on his bucket. It was a place clinging to survival by its fingernails. It needed everything. And something in her, something she hadn't felt since she was a girl, wanted to be needed. "I'll stay," she said. "For now." The days that followed were the hardest of Clara's life. And the most honest. She learned to mend fences with wire and pliers until her palms bled. She learned to feed cattle and muck stalls and haul water from the creek in buckets that left bruises on her shoulders. She learned to cook on the cast-iron stove. Badly at first, then better, then well enough that old Pete declared her biscuits almost as good as Eliza's, which made Silas go quiet for a full hour. She learned the rhythms of the ranch, the way the mornings started before the sun and the evenings ended long after it set. She learned the names of the horses. Jasper, a chestnut gelding with a crooked blaze, and Dulcinea, a gray mare with the temperament of a duchess. She learned that Silas read every night by lamplight, that he talked to the horses more than he talked to people, and that when he thought no one was watching, he stood at the fence line and looked east, toward Kane's land, with an expression that was not fear, exactly, but something close to it. Readiness. One evening, sitting on the porch while the sunset turned the bluffs to gold, old Pete told her more. "Silas and Virgil used to be friends," he said, keeping his voice low. "Years ago when they were young, before Virgil's daddy died and left him all that land and money. Before it turned him mean." Pete shook his head. "Virgil wanted to buy Hearthstone. Silas wouldn't sell. Virgil don't take well to the word no." "What did he do?" "Started small. Poisoned the well once. Couldn't prove it, but the cattle got sick. Cut fences so the herd wandered onto his land. Then claimed them as strays. Got the bank to call in Silas's loan early. Every dirty trick in the book." Pete spat into the dirt. "Then Eliza got sick. And Silas, he just broke. Stopped fighting. Stopped caring about the land, the cattle, everything. I've been holding this place together with spit and prayer ever since." Clara felt something tighten in her chest. "And Virgil? Virgil's been waiting. Waiting for Silas to give up, sell out or die. Whichever comes first." Pete looked at her with those old, sharp eyes. "And now you're here. A bride that was supposed to be his. Sitting on the porch of the man he hates most in this valley." He let that sink in. "When Virgil finds out, and he will find out, there's going to be trouble." Clara's stomach turned cold. "How much trouble?" Pete didn't answer. He just looked east, toward the bluffs, where the shadows were growing long and dark. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She lay in the narrow bed that had once belonged to Eliza Drummond and stared at the ceiling and listened to the coyotes howling in the hills. She thought about Boston. About the man she'd fled, not Virgil, but another man, another cage. A factory foreman named Harold Briggs who'd courted her with sweetness and then locked her in a room for 3 days when she tried to refuse his proposal. She'd escaped through a window. She'd answered Virgil Kane's advertisement the same week. She had run from one trap and walked straight into another. Or had she? Because something was happening at Hearthstone. Something she hadn't expected. Something growing between the mended fences and the shared meals and the long, quiet evenings on the porch. Something in the way Silas looked at her when he thought she wasn't looking. Not with hunger or possession, but with wonder. As if she were a wildflower that had somehow bloomed in cracked, dry earth. She was falling, and that terrified her more than Virgil Kane ever could. 3 days later, the rider came. He appeared at the gate just before noon. A lean man on a black horse, wearing a long duster and a hat pulled low. He didn't dismount. He just sat there, still as a fence post, watching the house. Silas saw him from the barn. He set down the harness he'd been mending and walked to the porch. Clara saw him pick up the rifle. "Stay inside," he said. The rider tipped his hat, turned the horse, and rode east without a word. He didn't need to speak. The message was clear. Virgil Kane knew. 2 days of silence followed. The kind of silence that presses against the walls of a house and fills every room with weight. Silas barely spoke. He worked from before dawn until after dark, pushing himself harder than Clara had ever seen. Digging post holes, reinforcing the barn door, checking the rifle, cleaning it, loading it, setting it by the door. He moved like a man preparing for a siege. Old Pete carried a shotgun now too, the ancient double-barrel he kept above his bunk, and he positioned himself on the porch each evening with a lantern and a tin of tobacco, watching the eastern road. Clara tried to maintain normalcy. She cooked. She cleaned. She tended the garden Eliza had planted years ago, which had gone wild with sage and thistle but still held, in its stubborn heart, a few tomato plants and a row of beans that refused to die. But her hands shook when she worked, and her eyes kept drifting east. On the third morning, the letter arrived. It was nailed to the gatepost. No envelope. Just a single sheet of paper, written in a hand that was elegant and precise. The same hand that had written to her for 4 months. "Miss Whitfield, you belong to me by contract and by law. I have paid your passage. I have prepared my home for your arrival. You will present yourself at Kane Ranch by sundown tomorrow, or I will come and collect what is mine. V. Kane." Clara read it twice. Her blood ran cold, then hot. "What is mine?" She showed it to Silas. He read it once, folded it, and put it in his pocket. "You're not going," he said. "He'll come. Let him." "Silas." She grabbed his arm, and the touch surprised them both. It was the first time she'd touched him. His skin was warm and rough under her fingers, and he went very still, like a wild horse feeling a hand for the first time. "He'll bring men. You know he will. Pete told me what he's done to this ranch, what he's capable of. I won't be the reason." "You're not the reason," Silas said, and his voice cracked for the first time since she'd known him. He looked at her, and the mask he wore, the stone face, the iron will, slipped. Underneath was something raw and desperate and honest. "Clara, you're not the reason for any of this. Virgil Kane has been trying to destroy me for years. This was always coming. You just made me remember why it's worth fighting." The air between them went electric. Closer than they'd ever stood. Close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his gray eyes, the way his pulse beat hard in his throat. "I'm not letting you go to that man," he said, quieter now. Almost a whisper. "Not today. Not ever." She should have argued. She should have been practical, reasonable, safe. Instead, she said, "Then don't." Sundown came and went. Clara didn't go to Kane Ranch. And at exactly 7 minutes past dark, 3 riders appeared on the eastern ridge. Old Pete saw them first. He stood from his chair on the porch and spat his tobacco into the dust and said, very calmly, "They're here." Silas came out of the house with the rifle. Clara stood behind him in the doorway, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth. The riders came down the ridge slowly, deliberately, their silhouettes black against the last bruise of twilight. 2 of them were big men, ranch hands, carrying Winchesters across their saddles. The third rode in front, Virgil Kane. He was not what Clara had imagined. He was handsome, truly handsome, with clean features and dark hair and a suit that looked tailored, even out here in the dust and wind. He wore a silver watch chain across his vest and polished boots that caught the lantern light. He looked like a gentleman. He looked like the man in the letters. But his eyes were wrong. They were dark and flat and empty, like windows in a house where the lamps had all gone out. And when he smiled, which he did broadly as he dismounted, the smile never reached those eyes. Not even close. "Good evening, Silas," he said, as if they were meeting at a church social. "It's been a while." "Not long enough," Silas replied. He didn't raise the rifle, but he held it low and ready. Virgil's gaze moved past Silas to Clara. The smile widened. Something predatory stirred behind those dead eyes. Miss Whitfield, you're even lovelier than your photograph suggested. He removed his hat and held it over his heart. I must admit, I was hurt when you didn't arrive. I prepared a fine supper. Roast chicken. Wine from California. A bouquet of wildflowers on the table. He sighed theatrically. Imagine my disappointment. She's not going with you, Virgil, Silas said. Virgil's smile didn't waver. I wasn't speaking to you. He took a step closer. Miss Whitfield. Clara. May I call you Clara? I feel as though I know you. Your letters were so open, so honest. You told me about your life in Boston, your difficulties, your longing for a fresh start. His voice dropped, intimate, almost tender. I can give you that start. A real home, security, everything I promised. Clara's throat tightened. Standing here, hearing his voice, that smooth, careful, beautiful voice. She understood how Martha Kane had been fooled, how any woman could be fooled. He was a masterwork of deception, a trap dressed in silk. I've made my decision, Clara said. Her voice shook, but she didn't look away. I'm staying here. The smile vanished. It didn't fade or retreat. It simply ceased to exist, replaced by something cold and hard and terrifying. That, Virgil said softly, was not one of the options. He turned to his men. A slight nod, almost imperceptible. The two ranch hands raised their Winchesters. Old Pete cocked the shotgun on the porch. The sound was enormous in the silence. Virgil. Silas's voice was steady as stone. You ride off my land right now, or this ends in a way none of us can take back. Virgil studied him, tilted his head like a snake examining its prey. You know what I think, Silas? I think you've been alone so long you've confused a stray woman for a miracle. But she's not yours. She was never yours. And this sad little patch of dirt you call a ranch. He gestured around him with contempt. This is barely even yours anymore. He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. He held it up in the lantern light. Bank called in your note last week. Did you know that? I bought the debt this morning. Every penny. Which means I own Hearthstone now. He smiled again, the real smile, the terrible one. So you see, you're not just giving me the girl. You're giving me the ranch, the cattle, and whatever's left of your pathetic pride. He let the document flutter to the ground. You have until sunrise. Then he mounted his horse, tipped his hat to Clara, and rode into the dark, leaving Silas standing in the yard with a rifle in his hands and the ruins of everything he had left scattered at his feet. Clara found Silas in the barn at midnight. He was sitting on a hay bale in the dark, the rifle across his knees, Eliza's photograph in his hand. He wasn't looking at it. He was just holding it the way a drowning man holds the last piece of wreckage before the current takes it. Is it true? Clara asked from the doorway. About the bank. About the debt. Probably. His voice was hollow. I've been behind on payments for a year. Maybe longer. I stopped counting. She sat down beside him. The barn smelled of hay and horse sweat and old wood. Jasper snorted softly in his stall. Dulcinea stamped a hoof. Then we leave, Clara said. Tonight. Both of us. Pete too. We ride west, toward the mountains. Start over somewhere Virgil Kane can't reach. Silas shook his head slowly. This is Eliza's land. She's buried out behind the house, under the cottonwood tree. I promised her I'd never leave. He paused. I've broken a lot of promises in my life. I won't break that one. Then what do we do? He was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, harder, sharper. The voice of a man who had made a decision and was already walking toward it. Virgil said sunrise. He'll come back with his men, maybe more than two this time. He'll come to take the ranch, take you, and put me in the dirt if I stand in his way. Silas looked at her. So I won't wait for him to come. I'll go to him. Clara's heart seized. That's suicide. No, that's the only play I've got. He set the photograph down gently on the hay bale. Virgil Kane is a coward dressed up as a king. He hides behind money and lawyers and hired guns. But take those away and he's nothing. He's a scared boy who can't stand the word no. Silas. I'm going to ride to his ranch. Alone. Before dawn. I'm going to call him out in front of his men, in front of his bunkhouse, where he can't hide behind a piece of paper. And I'm going to end this. He'll kill you. Silas stood. He looked down at her, and in the moonlight leaking through the barn slats, his face was carved in silver and shadow. He looked ancient. He looked beautiful. Maybe, he said, but he won't touch you. That's all that matters. Clara stood too. She was shaking. Shaking with fear, with fury, with something so enormous it had no name, or maybe it had every name that had ever been whispered or shouted or written in a letter or carved into a tree. Don't you dare, she whispered. Don't you dare ride off to die for me without telling me the truth first. What truth? That you feel it too. This, whatever this is. These 2 weeks. The meals and the silence and the way you look at me when you think I'm not watching. Tell me it's real. Tell me it means something. Because I will not stand here and let you die for a woman you never said a single honest word to. The barn went silent. Even the horses held their breath. Silas Drummond. The scarred, quiet, broken man who hadn't smiled in 3 years, looked at Clara Whitfield and said the truest thing he'd ever spoken. It's real. You walked up my road like an answer to a question I'd stopped asking. And every morning since, I've woken up afraid. Not of Virgil, not of losing this ranch, but afraid that today's the day you come to your senses and leave. He touched her face. His calloused hand was impossibly gentle. I don't deserve you. I know that. But if I'm going to die, I'd rather die knowing I said it. She kissed him. It was fierce and desperate and tasted like dust and coffee and sorrow and hope. All the contradictions of the frontier in a single moment. When she pulled back, her eyes were wet but her jaw was set. Then you're not going alone, she said. Clara. I said, you're not going alone. They rode out at 4 in the morning. Silas on Jasper. Clara on Dulcinea. Old Pete stayed behind with the shotgun and a promise to ride for the marshal in Broken Creek. A real lawman, not the puppet Virgil kept in Burial Flats, if they weren't back by noon. The land was dark and vast and cold. The stars were so thick they looked like spilled flour across a black tablecloth. The horses moved quietly, their hooves muffled by the damp earth. Neither Silas nor Clara spoke. There was nothing left to say. Everything that mattered had been said in the barn. They reached Cane Ranch just as the eastern sky began to pale. It was everything the letters had promised. A white house with a wraparound porch, glass windows, a large barn, corrals full of cattle, a bunkhouse with smoke curling from its chimney. It was prosperous and handsome, and it looked, from the outside, like a dream. But Clara knew what dreams could hide. Silas dismounted at the gate. He tied Jasper to the post and took the rifle. Stay with the horses, he said. If this goes wrong, it won't. He almost smiled. That scar tugged at his lip, and this time, the expression almost formed. Then he walked through the gate and into Virgil Kane's yard and shouted his name. The word rang across the ranch like a bell. Kane! Silence. Then doors opened. Ranch hands emerged from the bunkhouse. 4 of them now, not 2, bleary-eyed and armed. They fanned out across the yard, rifles ready. The front door of the White House opened last. Virgil Kane stepped onto his wraparound porch in a pressed white shirt and suspenders, a Colt revolver holstered at his hip. He looked like he'd been expecting this. He looked like he'd been hoping for it. Well, Virgil said, descending the steps, you saved me the ride. I want you to hear this, Virgil, in front of your men, in front of God and this whole valley. Silas's voice carried in the dawn air like cannon fire. You bought my debt. Fine. You can have the paper. But Clara Whitfield is a free woman who made a free choice, and you will not touch her. Not now. Not ever. Virgil laughed. It was a small, cruel sound. You rode 7 miles to tell me that? You could have written a letter. I'm not finished. Silas took a step forward. I know what you did to Martha. I know what you do to anyone who stands in your way. But I'm standing in your way now, Virgil, and I'm not moving." Virgil's face went cold. The laughter died. His hand drifted toward the Colt. "You should have sold when you had the chance, Silas. You should have taken the money and disappeared." His fingers wrapped around the grip. "Now you'll just disappear." He drew, and Silas was faster. Not faster like a gunfighter in a dime novel. Faster the way a man is fast when he has something to live for. Something that just kissed him in a barn and called him back from the dead. The rifle shot cracked the morning open like an egg. Virgil Kane spun sideways, the Colt flying from his hand, a red bloom spreading across his right shoulder. He hit the ground hard, clutching the wound, screaming. Not in pain but in rage, in disbelief, in the fury of a man who had never been denied anything in his life. The ranch hands raised their Winchesters, and then a voice, old, sharp, and absolutely furious, rang out from behind the gate. "Drop those weapons. All of you. Right now." Clara turned. Behind her, riding hard up the road in a cloud of dust, came 6 men on horseback. At their head was a lean, silver-haired man with a tin star on his chest the size of a biscuit. The marshal from Broken Creek. Old Pete, it turned out, hadn't waited until noon. He'd ridden out the moment they left. He'd ridden like the devil himself was chasing him, and he'd brought the law, the real law, straight to Virgil Kane's door. The ranch hands looked at the marshal. They looked at the armed deputies. They looked at Virgil Kane bleeding in the dirt. And one by one they set their rifles down. The days after the showdown moved slowly, the way days do when the world is rearranging itself. Marshal Tom Redfield had been looking for a reason to ride into Burial Flats for a long time. Virgil Kane's influence had kept the territory's real lawmen at arm's length for years. Threats, bribes, the convenient loyalty of a local sheriff who looked the other way. But a mail-order bride held against her will, a fraudulent land seizure, and a gunfight on a ranch porch, that was enough. More than enough. Redfield arrested Virgil Kane that morning. The shoulder wound was treated by a doctor in town, and then Virgil was put in chains and loaded into a wagon headed for the territorial courthouse in Cheyenne. His ranch hands were questioned. 2 of them talked about Martha Kane, about the poisoned well, about the cut fences, about the threats and the violence and the years of cruelty that had festered beneath the white paint and glass windows of that handsome house. The local sheriff, the one in Virgil's pocket, resigned before Redfield even asked. As for the debt on Hearthstone, it was declared void. The bank's president, a nervous man named Tillman who had facilitated Virgil's schemes for years, was persuaded by Marshal Redfield, and by the very real possibility of a prison cell, to forgive the note entirely. He signed the papers with shaking hands and a face the color of old milk. Hearthstone was free and clear. Silas received the news standing on his porch, Clara beside him, old Pete sitting on his bucket with a grin so wide it showed every gap in his teeth. "Well," Pete said. "I'll be damned." "Watch your mouth," Clara said. But she was smiling too. Spring deepened into summer. The valley turned green, not lush, never lush, but alive. The creek ran clear again, and the cattle grazed on grass that grew thick along its banks. Silas hired 2 new hands, young men from town who needed work and didn't mind the isolation of Hearthstone. The ranch began to breathe again. Clara discovered she had a talent for the land that surprised even her. She expanded the garden beyond Eliza's original rows, planting squash and peppers and sunflowers that grew tall enough to brush the windowsills. She learned to ride. Not the cautious, side-saddle riding of Boston women, but real riding, boots in the stirrups, hair loose in the wind, Dulcinea flying beneath her across the open plain. She learned the names of the stars. She learned the calls of the birds. She learned the way the light changed in the valley. Gold in the morning, white at noon, amber in the evening, and then that extraordinary purple twilight that lasted forever and felt like a prayer. She learned Silas. He was not an easy man to know. He carried his grief the way he carried everything. Silently, stoically, close to the bone. But slowly, day by day, he opened. He told her about Eliza. Not just how she died, but how she lived. How she sang while she cooked. How she named every calf born on the ranch. how she read to him at night because she loved the sound of stories spoken aloud. He told her about the scar on his face, a knife fight in Abilene when he was 19, drunk and foolish and convinced he was immortal. He told her about his father, a preacher who drank himself to death, and his mother, who walked into the prairie one winter morning and never came back. He told her about the years after Eliza, the darkness, the silence, the slow, deliberate erasure of himself. He told her he had considered letting the ranch die, considered letting himself die with it. "Then you showed up," he said one evening, sitting on the porch, watching the sun drop behind the mountains, with your Boston accent and your leather trunk and your absolute refusal to be afraid. "I was terrified," Clara said. "I know, but you did it anyway. That's not the same as not being afraid. That's courage." She leaned into him. His arm came around her, slowly, carefully, like a man remembering how to hold something precious. "Silas. Yeah. I came out here to marry a stranger. I know. I'd still like to, if the offer's there." He looked at her, and for the first time in 3 years, for the first time since Eliza, since the darkness, since the slow death of everything he'd cared about, Silas Drummond smiled. Not almost, not halfway. A real, full, honest smile that transformed his scarred face into something radiant. "Lady," he said, "the offer's been there since the night you walked through my door." They married in September under the cottonwood tree behind the house, the same tree where Eliza was buried. Felt right, not painful, not wrong. Felt like a continuation, like Eliza had planted the tree knowing someone would stand beneath it one day and begin again. Old Pete officiated, having acquired, somewhat dubiously, a certificate of ministry from a mail-order catalog that was probably legitimate. The 2 ranch hands served as witnesses. The cattle watched from the fence line with expressions of mild, bovine curiosity. Clara wore a blue dress she'd sewn herself from fabric bought in town. Silas wore a clean shirt and had shaved for the first time in what Pete called recorded history. He looked younger. He looked new. They said their vows simply, without fuss, the way people do when they mean every word. And when it was done, they stood together and looked out across the land. Their land, the red bluffs and the green valley and the creek and the mountains and the infinite impossible sky. Clara touched the fence post beside her. Carved into it, in Eliza's hand, were 2 words she'd noticed on her very first morning at Hearthstone and never mentioned until now. "Hold on." She traced the letters with her finger. "I think she was talking to you," Clara said softly. Silas looked at the carving. He looked at his wife. He looked at the ranch. Battered, imperfect, stubborn, and alive. "Yeah," he said. "I think she was." And in the valley of Burial Flats, beneath a sky so wide it could hold every broken thing and make it whole, Hearthstone endured. The wind blew warm from the west. The gate stood open. And the road, that long, dust-choked road that had carried Clara Whitfield to the wrong ranch and the right life, stretched out behind them like a story already told. She never looked back.